So what do you do when it dawns on you that you're the most powerful person in the room? And the answer to that is you leverage your power for the benefit and well-being of others.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today I get a chance to talk and get to know a new friend. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm excited. I get to be with the Tommy Lee. This is awesome.
Well, you know what, Chris? A lot of times because of my name, people have asked me, is it Tommy Lee Jones? Is it the cousin of Bruce Lee? All of these different things. Tommy Lee the Rocker. One time I booked a reservation at a restaurant. They really thought it was Tommy Lee the Rocker. Boy, were they disappointed when I didn't show up.
Well, I'm just thrilled to be with you, which is
Yeah.
awesome. Thanks for having
I
me.
hear we do have a connection because when did you were a student at Moody and you taught at Moody? When were you there, Chris?
Sure. So I was as a student at Moody from 2003 to 2007, and then went off, studied in New England, in Edinburgh, and then actually came back to teach at Moody beginning in, 2011, actually in
Okay.
Spokane, Washington. But then
Yes.
I taught a little bit in the Chicago campus as well, around 2020, 2021, around that time. So yeah, so I lived in
Yeah.
Chicago for several years, downtown, as well as in Indiana, Northwest Indiana, and had a great time there.
Yeah. I actually worked for Dr. Easley for a number of years. So my role was special assistant to the president. So I did major donor fundraising, pastors conference, and founders week for Dr. Easley for a number of years.
Yes, yes. So I was right there as a student during the transition. So I had 2 years
Yeah.
with Dr. Stoll, 2 years with Dr. Easley, and then I
Very
got to
good.
work under Dr. Nyquist, and
Yeah.
Mark Joe.
Yeah, very good. What now? Where are you right now? I know you're currently in Florida, but you teach in South Carolina. Tell me about your current role.
That's right. Yeah. So I am an associate professor in the PhD in leadership program at Anderson University in Anderson, South Carolina. And in our program, we have two essentially tracks in the leadership program. There's a ministry studies track and a business track. And so I get to work with people from all over, people from the business world as well as from the ministry world who want to get a degree in leadership. And yeah, it's just fascinating. A lot of the times the people in the business world, they want to know, how can I bring my faith and be a leader who's worth following, a faithful leader worth following in the marketplace.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have ministry leaders who are pastors who want to get a PhD in leadership as well.
Yeah. Now, Chris, when you were a student at Moody, was leadership like a high priority? Did you know you wanted to study and eventually teach on leadership? What did you think that you were going to do, and how did you get into this path of leadership?
Yeah, thanks for asking. My heart and passion is for the local church. It's always been for the local church. And what I observed is that when a local church has good, strong preaching and good, strong leadership, it's a healthy church. And unfortunately, there's a lot of churches that they have good leadership, but the preaching is rather weak, or they
Yeah.
have really
Yeah.
strong preaching and the leadership is weak. And so a lot of my degrees, undergrad, masters, when I was a student, I wanted to study the preaching because I thought I wanted to go into pastoral studies. And I did pastor for a little bit after seminary. But while I was there, I realized, hey, I haven't really studied too much in the leadership field. And so
Yeah.
that's what my doctorate turned into, was a leadership doctorate, because I wanted to learn more about how do we become better leaders and leaders worth following. And so now I get to teach a little bit of both, a little bit of preaching and a little bit of leadership, because it all comes back to my heart for the local church.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit more even about your book, but how did you even get started? This whole book of moving forward after messing up. Was there something that happened which caused you to start researching on this topic?
Right. Well, when it comes to the local church, being a pastor, and I was a pastor for several years, we loved celebrating, the recovery stories. We loved
Yeah.
celebrating the marriages that were restored, the addicts who were helped, the prodigals who came home. But the reality is, for every one that came home, for every one marriage that was restored, there were scores of others that the marriages ended in divorce. The
Yeah.
prodigals never came home. And it spoke to me personally because my brother is what we would call a prodigal, right? A prodigal child, where our paths are complete opposites. So at one point, he, as an alcoholic, he moved to Colorado when Colorado
Yeah.
changed their marijuana laws
Yeah.
back in the day. And he ended up being homeless and arrested. And yeah, he was far, far from God, far from our family. And so that was really the beginning of, hey, how do I walk this journey with him as a family member who loves him, walking alongside with him to help bring him back into the family and particularly into God's family.
Yeah. Krista, one thing I love about your book is I've been wrestling with hearing stories of all these leaders, especially who are Christ followers, pastors, who've made mistakes. And a lot of the times I hear people say, well, it's a private matter. You shouldn't, it's none of your business. But I'm sitting there, but why can't you just admit that you made a mistake and build off on it? And when I read your book, I said, that's it. That's what you should be doing. And that's why I want to talk with you about today. And so thank you very much for finding that time to do that.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be with you. And the reality is there's people who've messed up publicly, and like you said,
Yeah.
people who've messed up privately. I think there's public prodigals, but there's also a lot of functioning prodigals. These are people who we see every day, and you wouldn't think they were an alcoholic or have these addictions or have all these struggles, but they do. And the reality is, we all need help moving forward because we've all messed up, and thankfully, the God of second chances is right there to help us on
Yeah.
that journey.
So before we start talking about your book, when you start researching your book, how did you sit there and come up with ideas? Where did you go for your research? Was it a lot of interviewing people? Was it studying scripture? Talk to me about the making of this book.
And it's funny, the making of books, they sometimes take a life of their own, and there's always an interesting story there. So mine is, I had, my brother, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But actually, it started with I used to write for Moody Bible Institute, has a 30-day devotional, monthly devotional
Yeah.
called
Yep.
Today in
Yep.
the
Yep.
Word. And the editor wanted me to write for I don't know, the month of June one year on the God of second chances. That was the title of that 30-day devotional. And all it is every day there's a short passage of scripture and then several paragraphs, maybe a page on the God of second chances and on that passage of scripture. And we got such good feedback from that 1 month, and people just wrote in from all over, from prisons, from recovery centers, rehabilitation centers, but also just parents wrote in about how it really hit home because they have
Yeah.
a family member or a friend who needed a second chance, or they themselves needed a second chance. And the same month that came out, I dove a little bit deeper into my personal story with my brother, and I realized, wow, here's somebody who needs a second chance. And so my editor encouraged me to pitch it to Moody Publishing to say, hey, can we make this into a chapter book? So it's not a devotional. It's no longer devotional, but that was really the start of it,
Wow.
to realize, wow, there's a need out there for
Yeah.
something like this.
Very, very, very good. Here's the one thing is I love some of the themes that you talked about: self-reflection, humility, forgiveness, moving forward. Is all of us are going to mess up. And even here, as we're talking with some of our folks in Indonesia, Malaysia, all of that, we're all going to mess up. But how do you rebuild your life after you mess up? It's not
Mhm.
saying, hey, it's none of your business. Hey, look, all of us are imperfect. How do we rebuild ourselves and work through some of those things?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first step is identifying reality, to understand that you have messed up. And like you said, just to admit that, to confess that. And here's some of my background in leadership. It may seem like we're coming across weak when we admit our failures, but actually, research shows it's the exact opposite of that. That actually, when you're able to admit your failures, you gain more credibility and trust from your followers that, wow, this is a human being, and they are confident in themselves. They're confident, we would say, in God as well, that they are able to be forgiven. And that's somebody that I want to follow. That's somebody that I want to work for or work with because, hey, they realize they've messed up, they've admitted it,
Yeah.
and now they want help moving forward.
Yeah. But wouldn't you say, Chris, it does this whole thing about self-reflection. That means you have to be, you have to know yourself. You have to know your hidden agendas, your motives, but you have to be secure in yourself.
You do. And I think the good thing is, I think for believers, is we know who holds our true identity, right? That we are in Christ, that our mess ups, our mistakes are not what defines us, but rather Christ is the one, God is the one who defines us. And so, that's one way that we can own up to our mistakes, that we have the ability to, because we realize, hey, we are a fallen people, but thankfully God is there who receives us, heals us, makes us whole, and we are found in
Yeah.
him. But it does take that confessing. Yeah.
Chris, I was at Moody Seminary before I worked for Dr. Easley. One of my professors during my senior seminar was Dr. Julius Walloy Singh. And
Mm.
Julius said to me, he says, Tommy, if I could speak into your life, you're very good about going, doing. Before all this, I built cell towers for 10 years, and I was
Oh, wow.
highly motivated to doing a good job. But he says, the one thing I do encourage you don't know how to have self-reflection. You do not
Mm.
reflect upon the things in your life, good or bad, where you made mistakes, all of those things. If you do not really be able to focus on the reflection, you will truly never understand what God has called you to do. Chris, it's forced me to be honest with myself. Why did I just do that there? Why did I just say that thing? Why did my pride just go up when I had to deal with this situation? When someone called me out, why in the world did I react that way? Chris, I realized self-reflection was so key and for me to wrestle with all those things.
It is, and it's a sign, I think, of maturity, right? So I have 3 kids. They're little, 8, 6, 5. They're younger, and whenever they fight or whenever they have a fight, they come to me, and that's essentially what we're working on: is reflecting. Well, how did you handle the situation? What do you think about the situation? What could you have done differently in this situation? And it's something you try to teach your kids so that they will grow up to become mature, to have these instincts, then to be able to relate with other people. And unfortunately, we still need to learn that. And we have to pause, get ourselves out of the situation, to then look at the situation from somewhat of an objective standpoint, so that we can realize, how did we act and how did we treat and why did we do the things that we do, or things that we did. And, unfortunately, like for people like my brother who got arrested, he was forced to have self-reflection. I mean, when you're in a
Yeah.
jail cell, that's essentially what you are doing. What they want you to do is pause and self-reflect. Now, hopefully for many of our listeners, it doesn't get to that we don't have to be arrested to pause and have self-reflection, that this is something we should really be doing on a daily basis.
Yeah. And I find a lot of times people don't do that self-reflection because they just don't want to deal with what they see.
Yeah.
And it does make it hard for you to ask, what are the motivations? What are the things? Is it the greed? Is it the anger, the insecurities that's driving me some of those things?
Yeah. And the thing that I think about too is, again, coming from a Christian standpoint, it's the sin that's within us that drives all of those things. And I had a student, actually. I'm a learner. I love just learning about things, and I learn stuff from my students all the time. I mentioned this in the book. One of the times a sermon was preaching in one of my preaching classes, and he started his sermon with, he gave everybody a piece of chocolate. And he said, I want you to look at this chocolate. Look how shiny, look at the sheen on that chocolate. And everyone's like, ooh, yeah, I can't wait to try this. And then he said, smell the chocolate. So we all put it up to our nose. We smelled the chocolate. Oh, it smelled so good. He's like, don't you want to taste it? And we're like, oh, yeah, we definitely want to taste this chocolate. Who doesn't like chocolate? And so he said, all right, go ahead and take a bite of that chocolate. So we all take a bite of it. And it was the worst tasting chocolate we've ever tasted. It was
Yeah.
so bitter because it was baking chocolate. It wasn't milk chocolate, dark chocolate. It was baking chocolate. And he said, this chocolate is just like sin. It looks so good, but it has a bitter bite. And he went on to preach about David and Bathsheba, about how sin looks so good, but it has a bitter bite. And so often in our lives, we look at the world, we look at situations, and we think one thing, we think this is going to be really good, and we don't pause to do that self-reflection or to think wisely about how what this decision is going to mean for us. And we dive in and we take a bite, and it has ramifications that take sometimes years to remedy and to help and to fix.
Yeah. And But Chris, a lot of times it is you got to have a spirit of humility. And in
Mm,
this day and age, with all of the social media platform and the power dynamics, I think of many pastors that have been in news is you surround. I still remember in class is when you heard about some of the pastors who fell, our professor said to us, have you realized that some of these pastors who fell also had accountability, elder boards, small groups that held up? If you want to sin, you can easily hide things from different people.
yeah.
Sometimes, too often, a lot of times, the power dynamics does not create that humility. How do you address that? How does a person with a lot of power, whether it's in the church, whether it's in work or anything, continue to remain humble in order to self-reflect, in order to deal with these situations?
Yeah, and it's a great reminder too. I remember actually you mentioned Dr. Easley, and he was the president when I was a student there. And he mentioned several times from the chapel stage that in his Bible on the front cover, he keeps a list of names
Yeah. Uh-huh.
of high profile pastors or leaders who have fallen from grace as a reminder to him that, hey, it can happen to anybody. It can happen to anyone. And so, yeah, even though we have these accountability, if we're not honest with them, if we're not honest with ourselves, and how do we become honest with others, honest with ourselves? It's through humility. It's through
Yeah.
humility. It's recognizing our limitations. And then I like to say humility, there's that great line of humility is not thinking less of ourselves, but thinking of ourselves less, which is, I think that's fantastic. And I mentioned that. But one of the other ways I look at humility is trying to see things from God's perspective. And that's one of the things. So I don't know about you, but I have to fly every once in a while, to go visit family or to go to conferences. And I always try to get a window seat because as I look out, I see the world from a different perspective. Everything's so small. The cars look like little ants on the road there. The buildings that I thought were so huge as we're flying into like Chicago or something, they look like toy buildings. And I think in some sense, that's what humility is it's trying to see things from God's perspective and to realizing, wow, what would God say about this? And so if we can try to do that in our own lives, have a sense of humbleness and humility about us, or as Philippians 2 says, consider others' interest above our own. It helps us then to actually
Yeah.
not only have we addressed the issue, but we've confessed it and we can move forward because we realize, wow, this is bigger than me and I need some help to move forward after I've messed up.
Yeah. But Chris, how do you do this? Who have you seen who does that well? Is it every single day you're going to sit there and say, okay, I got to think that others are better than myself? Or is it like, for instance, I watch some of these leaders, especially in ministry, they surround themselves with younger people and they're very talented. And these younger people are part of their lifestyle, the private planes, the large honorariums, all of that stuff. They're not going to say no to you. Who has done it well? And what are the patterns that you've seen that allows them to do it well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a list on the other side of the Bible that said these are a lot of people who have
Yeah.
done it well. And maybe if we spent some time, we could think about it. I think of some of my mentors, from either seminary, or even at Moody, some of my colleagues, former colleagues there. I think they've done it well. Some people ask me, hey, you're into the preaching world. Who would you say are some of the best preachers out there? And I usually tell them some of the best preachers are the ones you've never heard of because they're
Yeah.
pastors and
Yeah.
preachers in small rural churches in, Georgia and Massachusetts, wherever they may be, because I think they've kept their priorities right. I think they know who they are on the inside. They understand their values. They understand what God has done for them. They understand, like as we mentioned, they're one slip up away from ruining not only their lives but the lives of their family and the lives of their ministry. So yeah, I might ask you the same question, Tom Lee. How have you seen anybody in your life, in your circle? You get to interview a lot of people as well who have done this extremely well that we can learn
You know,
from?
I remember even dealing with some of the conferences with Tim Keller for City to City.
Mm.
And one young lady once asked him, Pastor Keller, how does it feel that you're a celebrity? And he said to her, you should never feel comfortable when someone worships you. And he talked
Yeah.
about how God allowed him to fail early on in his church experience as a pastor. But he says it
Mm,
was that experience that taught me to be secure in who I was. And that once the book deals came, the speaking deals came, and he says, it didn't bother me because I was secure in who I was. And it's a
mm,
choice. I think of my friend Alan Barnhart and Barnhart Crane. I literally just talked with them. Their organization gives $3 million a month away to different ministries. And he will tell the story of how he gave away ownership of the company because it would have been too tempting as it could. You have to learn how to actively give power away and not
yeah.
steward that power, because when you try to sit there and say, oh, God will protect me, it's too tempting. It's just too tempting. You got to learn to give power away. And those are probably some of the best, the people who have learned to do that, I find, are the best ones.
Yeah, it reminded me. I was actually just teaching a class yesterday on servant leadership with
Yeah.
an organization. They actually build essentially parking lots or stadiums. So this is a big construction building company. They want to do a class, an 8-week class in servant leadership that I do, and this was with in the class was mostly of the leaders of the organization, the C-suite people, head of HR, things like that. And I use this illustration from Barack Obama's inauguration. So the president of the United States, before the big ceremony, they
Yeah.
actually have a small church gathering, church service with him. And there was a preacher who was tasked to give a sermon directly to Barack Obama, not to everybody else, but just to
Yeah.
Barack Obama. And he started with the question of, what do you do when it dawns on you that you're the most powerful person in the room?
Yeah.
Because in that sense, Barack Obama is the most powerful person in the room. But the reality is, too, when Barack Obama is not in the room and all those other people go to their rooms, they're the most powerful person in the room, whether
Yeah.
it's the vice president or the secretary of defense or secretary of commerce or whoever it was. So what do you do when it dawns on you that you're the most powerful person in the room? And the answer to that is you leverage your power for the benefit and well-being of others. And he
Yeah.
used the example from Luke 13, Jesus. And when Jesus was in the upper room, he was the most powerful person in the room. And what did he do? He served other people by washing their feet. He leveraged his power and his authority, right? Because the text says all authority has been given unto me, but he leveraged it for the well-being and the benefit of others. And so, when it comes to, talk about humility, right?
Yeah.
About washing someone else's feet, or like you said, dispersing that power and authority to others, giving it away so that we can remain humble because we know who we are. We know who we are in light of who God
Yeah.
sees us as.
And Chris, you mentioned a couple of Bible stories in the book. You talk about Joseph, you talk about Peter, you talk about the Samaritan woman, and all the other stuff. I think a lot of times with Joseph is in Genesis, the author of Genesis tells us that Jacob and Esau is looking for Jacob and wants to meet him. And Jacob is scared because he does not know. The guy has cheated his brother Esau a couple of times already with his birthright blessing, all that stuff. Esau had every right to take revenge on him. And so when they meet each other, it is funny because if you make the observation, it tells us that Jacob, and it gives a list of his so-and-so with their children, so-and-so with their children. It gives us no name of the children. And it gives us a final child, and it is Joseph. Why
Hmm.
in the world did the author of Genesis tell us specifically that Joseph was there? Joseph watched as his uncle Esau, who had every right to take a revenge, forgives
Hmm.
his dad because he had to do the same thing 20 years later.
Yeah. Well, forgiveness, right? When it comes to how do we move forward? Yeah, it comes to forgiveness. And, you think about, the page, when I thumb through the pages of scripture, what I see is a book of people who have messed up, right? Like the ones, you just talked about, right? Esau, yep. Jacob messed up. Yep. Joseph messed up. David messed up. The apostles messed up. They all messed up.
Yep,
But the
yep, yep,
reality
yep.
is that, yeah, they were in need of forgiveness. They were able to forgive. We need to forgive. We need to ask for forgiveness as well. Not only of forgiveness from God, but also forgiveness from the person that we see in the mirror every day. Sometimes we have to just forgive ourselves, which is sometimes the hardest thing and the hardest person to forgive.
Yeah, yeah. Chris, you teach with a lot of young people. what is, as they look at your book, as they watch this interview, what do you want young leaders to know, whether it's from your own life or lessons about forgiving other people or when you mess up? What do you want them to learn and hear?
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that convicted me, another one of the Bible stories that I use in the Bible, and it's really a running theme throughout the Bible, is the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15. Because in that one, and everybody knows the story of the prodigal son, he wants his father's inheritance, squanders it, comes back, asks for forgiveness. But in that story, there's two sons, and there's the older brother in that story. And that's where I think a lot of listeners, a lot of Christians, if we were really humble and honest with ourselves, we would identify with the older brother in the story. And that's where I think I was. Because my brother, he, like I said, moved off to Colorado, was homeless, arrested. And part of me was like, well, I'll just wait till he comes to his senses. And then when he comes back after, a tongue lashing, then we might accept him in. And I didn't really do much to pursue him. And in that story, which was so convicting to me, it's actually the third of three stories that Jesus tells. In the first story, there's a shepherd. He loses a sheep. He sacrifices the 99, leaves it, searches for that lost one, finds it, brings it back. The second story, there's a woman. She's got 10 coins. She loses one of them. She lights a lamp, sweeps the floor, carefully looks for it, searches everywhere, finds it. There's rejoicing. And then you have the prodigal son story. There's a lost son, but no one goes and searches for the lost son. And if you're following the theme, well, somebody was supposed to go search for the lost son. And it wasn't the father's responsibility. It was the brother's responsibility to go after the prodigals in their lives. And I think that's one of the things that I want to share and communicate with young people is, you might be like the younger brother in that story who, needs to come back to the father. Like my brother needs to come back home, and he's doing well. He's out of jail, but he's not a believer yet. But I think a lot of Christians, we identify with that older brother, and we need to be the ones going after the prodigals, pursuing them, helping them along the way, walking that journey with them. We can't do it, for them, but we have to open up the door, open up lines of communication so that when they are ready to come back, it's going to be such an easy road back. And when they come back, there'll be a celebration like you've never seen before.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Chris, from your days at Moody to where you are right now, what is it about leadership that you now know that you didn't know 10, 15 years ago?
Well, that's a great question. I think a lot of times when I used to think about leadership, it was about, power, authority. It was about command, control. It was about setting, you could even say setting vision and direction. And in some sense, yes, leadership is about that. But what I've learned is that actually leadership is all about people. Yeah. It's all about people. And it's you not telling people where to go, but walking alongside them, showing them, demonstrating, influencing them, building trust, and inspiring them, and not controlling them, not telling them everything where they need to go, what they need to do, but it's trusting them, it's inspiring them, it's serving them. So I think that was a big shift for me. And this goes for whether you're in the church, in nonprofit organizations, or for-profit organization, right? That, you have a choice. Are you going to command people? Are you going to have that authoritative, transactional leadership attitude? Or are you going to be transformational? Are you going to be servant-led? Are you going to focus on the people? When you focus on the people, everything else will take care of itself.
Yeah. And wouldn't you say a lot of times, look, you can sit there and be authoritative and all that stuff. And sometimes if you're an assembly line or something, you need that. And in the ministry, you'll get things done. You'll get your programs done, all that stuff. But you're not allowing people to fail, to think, to grow, all of this stuff, which I think is so important long term.
Exactly. Yeah. There are times, wartime. Yeah. I think the general should probably tell his soldiers where to go. But if you're not in those times, right, the other times what we're trying to do, I think just like Jesus did with his disciples, is he walked alongside them. He helped them to grow. That was his main mission field right there, were his disciples. And he knew that if he could get through to them, they could get through to others and the rest. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that should be our mentality as well.
Yeah, yeah. Moving forward after messing up, a new future with the God of second chances. Chris, if people want to follow you, where can they look? I know you're teaching as a professor, but do you have a website? Do you, as a social media? Where can they follow you at?
Yeah, I do. Usually I just Google my last name, Rappazini, because I'm the only one out there. I mean, my brother and I, but he doesn't have much presence, online. So Google Rappazini, or you could just type in Faithful Steps Forward, faithfulstepsforward.com. So Faithful Steps Forward is the organization that I founded that works with leaders, either in the nonprofit sector,
Yeah.
churches, or for the for-profit, where I get to, help them. So you could just Google those things, or just find me on, social media, anything like that.
Yeah. And Chris, besides teaching these days, are you doing it seems like you're doing coaching. You're also doing consulting. What are all the different things that you're doing?
Yeah, well, thankfully with this program, PhD in leadership program, all of the classes are in the evenings because people are working during the day. So during my day I get to work with a lot of organizations. If I'm not writing or researching or things like that, I get to, coach, again, pastors or just leadership professionals on how they want to move forward, some goals that they want to set and things like that. I do some keynote speaking addresses, as well as leadership training, all online, which is great because I can zoom in anywhere around the globe to help people as they want to grow as leaders themselves.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you so much for making time, Chris.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.